Hello, and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I'm Adiola Adejobi.
And I'm Jason Clark, president of the MBBA. The Metropolitan Black Bar Association is the largest association of predominantly African-American attorneys in New York. Our goal is to advance equality and excellence in the pursuit of justice, assist in the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers.
The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process. Today, we are going to talk about federal immigration agencies. Joining us are Anu Joshi, Senior Director of Immigrant Rights and Policy, and Alvin Bragg, Co-Director of New York Law School's Racial Justice Program. Welcome, and let's get to it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Great. So thank you both for joining us today, especially to talk about such an important and timely topic when we're talking about immigration. But one of the things I think that I tend to see is that while people hear a lot about immigration, they hear about terms like ICE and DHS, people don't always know the entire structure and really what this system looks like. So Anu, maybe a great way to get started is just to discuss, what's the structure, what is the Department of Homeland Security, and, what should somebody know if they're just learning about immigration and federal agencies for the first time?
Sure, and again, thank you so much for having me. Really happy to be here. I think one thing that's important to know is that the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, has only been around for about 16 years. It was created in 2003. And so, the agencies that accompany DHS, ICE, Customs and Border Protection, and USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, are new agencies. And so, when people talk about, well, we can't change it, we can't get rid of it, this is how it's always been, that's just not true. So I just want to put that out on the table first. So the three main agencies within DHS that do immigration are Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and they're responsible for enforcing immigration laws in the interior of the country. So that means everywhere except at the borders. That's at least what they're supposed to be doing. And then we have Customs and Border Protection, CBP, which includes Border Patrol. and they are supposed to be enforcing our immigration law at our borders. And that includes also, for example, at airports. So, when a foreign traveler comes into JFK and they have to go through customs and they have to go through Border Patrol, they're talking to agents from CBP. Those are also the people that are patrolling our southern and northern borders. And one thing that Congress has said is that Border Patrol is basically allowed to act with impunity within 100 miles of the border. And in New York, that's pretty much our entire state. There is a very small sliver of New York that's not encompassed by that 100 miles. And what we've seen is that Border Patrol agents, they've been given increasing amounts of money over the last 15 years. Their budget has almost tripled. And what we've seen is that they've used that money to hire agents to harass New Yorkers. It doesn't just happen in New York, but this is where we see it here. We see it across the northern border. They set up checkpoints. They board Greyhound buses and ask everyone for their identification to prove that they're a U.S. citizen. And so we've seen the ways in which CBP and Border Patrol specifically have really become a rogue agency, kind of doing whatever they want in pursuit of this president's anti-immigrant agenda. The last agency is USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And USCIS was set up to be the service arm of the Department of Homeland Security. So if you're a U.S. citizen and you marry someone who's not a U.S. citizen and you want to apply for them to get a green card to be able to live with you here, you would apply through USCIS. And before President Trump came into office, USCIS was very much a service agency. It's not funded by taxpayer dollars. It's funded by fees. So, like I said, if you're a U.S. citizen, you have to pay a fee that pays for your application to be processed, for the interview, for all of that stuff. And so they were supposed to treat, these folks as clients, as customers, because that's really what they are. Well, what we've seen is that under this administration, they've really turned USCIS into an enforcement agency, who is more concerned about keeping immigrants out than about ensuring that families can stay together, which is, the whole point of our immigration system. So that's kind of DHS in a nutshell.
And I just have a follow-up question. In regards to CBP and harassment, for our viewers, I'm sure they're wondering if they feel like they've been harassed, like what rights do they have?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the United States, no federal agent or law enforcement official can force you to prove your citizenship on the street. You do not have to carry your papers with you. And in fact, there was a lawsuit. Arizona tried to pass a law, or they did pass a law, SB 1070, that basically said the police can stop and ask anyone for proof of citizenship. And that law was struck down by the Supreme Court. They said you can't do that. But Border Patrol and CBP does have wide latitude within these 100 miles of the border. That's why they're able to set up checkpoints. That's why they're able to get on buses. The standard by which they have to have reasonable suspicion to believe that you're not a citizen is much less. And so you don't have to say you're a citizen or not. You don't have to answer their questions. In fact, we encourage people, if you are a citizen, to be an ally, right? And to stand with our immigrant brothers and sisters. But then they can, question you. They can keep you there for longer. They can do what they need to do to ascertain whether or not you're a citizen.
And so let me just follow quickly, because I just want the viewers to have this very specific information. They can go on the buses, but you said that they can't stop you on the street.
Well, they can, but you don't have to answer their question.
Okay. And on the bus, you don't have to answer the question.
Right.
Okay. Now, do they have to identify themselves as do they have like a badge? Like, how would someone know that this is just not a random person trying to create a citizen's arrest on their own? Yeah.
So it's a good question. There's a good distinction. So Border Patrol, yes, they wear uniforms. Border Patrol wears green uniforms. And so you'll know right away from their badge and from their uniforms that they're Border Patrol. ICE, on the other hand, can be plain clothes. Okay. They also can wear jackets and other paraphernalia that say police, but don't say ICE. And so obviously that causes a lot of confusion. And so, we have had instances where ICE has effectuated arrests and in public, and citizens, people watching this happen, call the police because they think they're witnessing a kidnapping.
Oh, wow.
Honestly. ICE is they're more of a law enforcement agency. Border Patrol is too, but in a different way. And so we've seen that happen in New York City, where people have literally called the police to report a kidnapping because they think that ICE is kidnapping people because of the way and the terrorizing way in which they're doing their job.
A footnote about non-ICE, non-federal agents, because may not happen as much in the city, but in some of the neighboring counties, we have a dynamic where the federal government has basically tried to deputize local police departments and have them enlisted to enforce federal immigration law. And so I think it's important when you talk about a street stop. Right. There's a couple of very good viral videos that maybe we can upload for folks, is that local police in New York State, local police officers they're not supposed to try to enforce an ICE warrant that is not issued by a judge. And so a distinction that folks should ask if they are stopped and presented with a warrant is, well, who signed that warrant? Is that a judicial warrant? And when we think about warrants, we're thinking usually about something issued by a court which compels you to go somewhere. ICE has what's called basically an administrative warrant, which means some other part of DHS, someone walks down the hall and gets a signature on a piece of paper, and they call it a warrant, which is very confusing, but it does not have the force of a judicial warrant. And so if someone's presented with one of those by a local law enforcement officer, there's a very helpful recent decision from an appellate court in our state saying that local police officers are not empowered. It's not within the scope of their authority to enforce federal immigration law. So that's a helpful distinction, I think, for people to know if they're approached by local police officers.
Right, yeah, and actually that's even a great time to probably talk about sanctuary cities. I know that people have mentioned for a while that, New York, for example, New York City is a sanctuary city. There are other large sanctuary cities out there. But what should somebody know if they're, for example, living in a quote-unquote sanctuary city? What additional rights are they essentially for? I know that it's not actually a legal term, but what can we tell people about what they should expect in New York and what should they expect when they're outside of New York City?
Well, and I guess there are two sides of the coin, and so maybe I'll start with the good side and not continue with the bad side, because it is misleading. But I'll start with the good news, which is in a jurisdiction like New York City, which describes itself as a sanctuary city, and you're right, it's not a defined term of art, it's not defined anyway, so it's sort of in the eye of the beholder. But as a general matter, the mayor and the police commissioner, have spoken out and said, look, in New York City, we value all of the residents here, and that it's important from a law enforcement perspective that everyone should feel comfortable coming forward, and which is not, that's not a belief shared at the federal level, right? So that sounds pretty, as I say it, like non-controversial and self-evident, but at the federal level, that's not something. And in these other jurisdictions locally, it's not a value that is shared. But here in the city, the thought is, look, we've got people who are victims of crimes, we've got witnesses, and what does that do to law enforcement if you are a victim, but you can't go into the local precinct and say, this happened to me, I need help? Well, that's terrible for everyone, right? That means there's someone out there who did something that we're not looking for. It's bad for our system of justice. So sort of as a starting point, the premise is that, if you come forward, you're not going to be asked about your immigration status by the NYPD, which is a very good thing. In addition to that, when I was talking about the feds trying to enlist local police departments, as a general matter, right? So the NYPD is not going to be doing a civil administrative warrant on behalf of ICE, and they're not, maybe the best way to put it, they're not going out of their way to assist ICE in affecting federal immigration policy. But with that said, there's some caveats to that. So.
Yeah, so unfortunately, as much as I wish it was so, city governments can't prevent ICE from coming into cities and doing what they see as their job, right? So, and New York City, as much as it wants to maybe put a bubble around New York City, can't prevent ICE agents from going to people's homes, to staking out people's work, to going to courthouses and arresting people, terrorizing communities. So that's, I think, an important thing to know. New York City's sanctuary policy is very good. One, it also, though, doesn't prevent NYPD from sharing fingerprints when people are booked, if they're arrested, with the federal government. What the NYPD won't do is if ICE asks them to hold someone for longer. So if someone's been arrested, they're about to be released, and then ICE says, hey, we want to come arrest this person on immigration, civil violations, will you hold them for an extra, couple hours, extra day, whatever? NYPD won't do that, except and unless they've been charged with a list of 170 crimes. And the New York Immigration Coalition, where I work, thinks that everyone deserves due process, and that once you start carving out specific people, then kind of the texture of what you're saying falls apart a little bit. Either we're a city that values people being able to exercise all of their due process rights, or we're not. The other thing I will say about New York City is that New York City made a historic investment in legal services for immigrants. And, that is something that we are incredibly proud of and thankful for. And so we ensure that almost all New Yorkers who are detained, so arrested and jailed by immigration, by ICE, if they can't afford one, get an attorney. Because one thing I think it's important to know is that you have to pay for your own attorney in immigration court. One is not provided to you. And for some people, they're facing, life and death. If they get deported, they very well could be deported to death, and they are not entitled to an attorney in court. And that's tragic. And it's, it's unjust. But in New York City, we have made that investment, and so that's incredibly important.
Now, I'm going back to what you were saying about people being deported and potentially facing death. Are there any programs or nonprofits that those individuals can contact as a affirmative step in order to prevent that?
Maybe the New York Immigration Coalition.
So here's what I'll say. The last few years have been an incredibly difficult time. And before that too, let's not pretend that President Obama, didn't do a lot of terrible things around immigration. But, nothing compared to President Trump. This country has, for decades, made a commitment to protect the most vulnerable. We do that through our participation in the refugee program and through our asylum program. And asylum is exactly what we're talking about here. It's where people can say, listen, if you send me home, I will be in danger, whether it's because of my gender or my sexual orientation or my political beliefs, and that my home country government is unwilling or unable to protect me. And one of the saddest things that this government has done is completely destroy that commitment that this country has made. That started really after World War II. And I think people know the story, but the United States, in one of our darkest moments, turned back a ship full of Jewish people during World War II because they didn't have the proper immigration documents. And they were returned most likely to very tragic consequences. And after World War II, the whole world made a commitment that that should never happen again. That as countries, that we should make a commitment that we need to protect the world's most vulnerable. Well, this administration has basically dismantled our entire asylum system, and yesterday announced that they were dropping the number of refugees that the United States will let in to the lowest number it's ever been, to 18,000 people, when we're facing a global refugee crisis. And so that's incredibly disheartening. your question was about nonprofits that can help, and there are many legal service providers in New York City and throughout the state that provide services. And yeah, you can come to our website, the New York Immigration Coalition, NYIC.org, to find some. I'll say that everyone's overwhelmed.
Right. That's Alvin. You looked at something.
I just want to say out loud what I think is obvious to your viewership and what is animating the current administration. I mean, this is you look at where the draconian policies are being directed, right there at the southern border. You hear what the president has said in the countries he describes. I mean, this is clearly this is not just some general patriotic or national or security. I mean, any of the coded terms that you hear come from some corners. I mean, it is so directly targeted at people that don't look like the president. So I think that's probably clear to everyone here and clear to your viewership. But I just feel like we have to say it out loud. It is so obvious.
Right.
And even to that point, I mean, I think I remember reading that there are like 55,000 people now who are part of, the immigration process who are currently detained or have been recently detained. And, you hear about issues such as, this public charge that's out there that seems like it's really focused on, folks who are coming from vulnerable, underrepresented backgrounds. But could we talk a little bit and kind of just go back to, what the impact is of kind of conflating the idea that we have these humanitarian systems that are part of our government agencies that are supposed to assist folks, and then we have these enforcement agencies, and the fact that they're all essentially not. Humanitarian one seems to have been cannibalized really by some of the enforcement. So like what's the impact of that? I guess when we look at how we're going to be viewed, and especially for folks who are coming to our country.
Yeah, I think you used the exact right word. I mean, it's if you put a few functions in the same house and you don't give them equal weight and equal priority. Basically, DHS has become an enforcement agency. I mean, that's what they do. They are enforcing these draconian policies, and there's query whether they should be under the same house and could be balanced, even if you impute and assume good faith, which I don't think we should here. But even just structurally, it's not structurally. Even if you had someone acting in good faith who was trying to balance the different functions, I think our priorities as a country, how we set things up, reflect priorities. So, right, you could have immigration functions in the Department of Labor because, part of the workforce, right, and everything it does for the workforce, or in the Department of Commerce because what it does for our businesses. So, the decision, made shortly, as you mentioned, after 9/11, to put all of this into one house. We could start there, and you get some synergies. There's some reasons that were articulated, but particularly then when you put the keys to the car in the hand of someone who's only thinking about enforcement and thinking about it in the most draconian senses, then everything else just falls off the table, and it begs the question of can this structure ever be trusted?
I'm going to go back. I mean, I think we have a white nationalist in the White House right now, right, and who on whole thinks that immigrants are bad for the country, especially immigrants of color who don't look like him, who don't share his worldview. And he has surrounded himself with people who have been in the anti-immigrant movement for decades, expressly in order to keep America for white people in leadership. And so no matter how the federal government is set up, no matter if that is who's in the White House, those are the goals that are going to be pursued, and that's what we've seen happen. And so every agency, every function has been about one, creating a narrative around who immigrants are, and that they're not to be trusted and that they're bad for the country, and two, to keep them out. And so that's what's happened, whether it's on the humanitarian side, as you mentioned, but, let's talk about the naturalization backlog. So people who have applied to be citizens, who have fulfilled all of the requirements and are just waiting for the federal government to approve their application is the longest it's ever been. There's over 1 million people waiting in the backlog to become citizens. Wow. And some of them submitted their application 20 months ago. and are still waiting. Can you imagine? These are people who want to stand up and say, pledge allegiance to our flag, who have done everything right, who have green cards, and this administration is slow walking them.
And that's a tricky thing too, because we don't always realize when we're thinking about our immigration policy or detention centers or what have you. I mean, there are criminal offenses and then there are civil offenses. Mm-hmm. And if someone is being detained, it's not because they're being accused of actually committing a criminal violation. We're talking about civil matters. So in some senses, there are some advantages, but at the same time, if it's a civil, it means that you don't have the same type of rights that people expect when we're talking about,
you don't get
when
an attorney.
Right, you don't get an attorney.
Right.
There isn't a specific amount of time which you're entitled to a speedy trial or what have you. But the other thing is, I know we're already even starting to come up with time, but one thing that people are always talking about is abolish ICE. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on whether or not that's something that should be looked at, or is there, just what should people think of when they hear those terms?
Well, here's what I'll say. ICE is an entirely rogue terrorizing agency right now. Their goal, and their head has said this, is to strike fear in immigrant communities. And I don't know about you, but I don't want my taxpayer dollars going to fund an agency whose sole goal is to rip apart families and to keep families afraid. Because these are American families that we're talking about, right? These are not some strangers. These are American families that ICE is going after. And I'll say, for example, in New York, the majority of undocumented immigrants in New York have lived here for more than 10 years. Their kids go to our schools, they pray in our churches, they pay income tax, they pay state tax, they pay, And so I just think that as a country, we really need to reevaluate where our priorities are, where we're putting our money. And this is not an agency that deserves that.
Anu said this earlier. The bigger problem, or the related problem, is the president. And so you have two. I would just separate them out, right? ICE is lawless right now, and I think we talked a little bit about the structure and how you could change the structure. You can move functions into other parts of the government that are trying to support the immigrant community. But so long as you have these agency heads who all report to a man who has the views you're talking about. We see Charlottesville. We could talk about. We can make the list is so long we can't go into it all. But just by one way of example, I mean, the Department of Justice. When we're talking about sort of the immigration proceedings. I mean, those the reporting structure there is going up to the Attorney General and Barr. Right. So it's not just the enforcement arm, which we've been talking about, and rightfully so, because that's where people interact, and that's where they feel the power of ICE most directly on the streets. But then when you go to adjudicate it, and you've had can't remember now if it was Barr or Sessions, but sort of wearing the hats in terms of clamping down the procedures and really making the process and the procedure of the hearings, when you actually do get a proceeding, what does that look like? Is justice being doled out? Which even if you change ICE and refine it, you still then have to go through the Attorney General and up through Barr, and that's a problem. So the issue is multi-layered.
Yeah, so the one thing that I'll say is I think that there's a lot that New York State can do to protect immigrant communities. We took a big step forward last June when we passed the green light law to allow undocumented immigrants to get driver's licenses. But there's a lot more that New York State can do. And so I just really encourage everyone to get engaged. And in the next legislative session, NYC is going to be fighting for a lot. And so we hope people will join us.
I mean, organizations like NYIC, folks should use them. One byproduct of all of the fear that's ICE brings with it is that you have fraudulent services, a real uptick in people saying, hey, I can help you navigate the system. And so what we saw before is at New York Law School, at the New York Attorney General's office, is a real uptick in immigration fraud services. And so I think to caution folks who have an issue and want to have a question, to be very careful about where they go and to go to established organizations to do a strong vet.
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Goodbye.
Bye.